Many of us have heroes or heroines who have inspired us at critical moments of our lives or maybe throughout our lives. My hero has been my brother, Pete Woodward. And he continues to inspire me in so many ways by who he is, what he believes in, his attitude towards life, his bedrock optimism, his wonderful and sometimes welcome sense of humor, his loyalty to his friends, his students, his faculty and staff, to Kathy, to our sister Joan, and me, and to his and Kathy's children. I'm not going to impress you with his resume, although it is available online at www.youwanttobeimpressed.com. Instead, I want to share some of my favorite experiences and remembrances of Pete on his 80th birthday. Childhood. As young boys, we had many wonderful times together, but we also fought a lot. And the one fight I remember more than any other took place in Tucson, Arizona. When our father was stationed there in World War II, my mother rented a small house in the Tucson foothills and had on her own decorated our Christmas tree. I don't know how the fight started, but Pete and I were behind the Christmas tree, wrestling, punching one another, trying to grab each other's testicles, when suddenly we crashed into the tree, knocking it over and breaking all but 3 of my mother's Christmas ornaments. It's hard to celebrate Christmas again without remembering that day. One thing most people don't know is that as a child, Pete suffered with terrible stuttering, and I cannot imagine the effect that had on him as a young child, but he's persevered and eventually overcame the stuttering. And I think that struggle probably had a lot to do with his ability to empathize with others' struggles as they made their way through life. High school. My father passed Topeka High School on his way to work, and so gave Pete and me a ride to school each day, but something happened on each of those days. Pete insisted on getting out of the car at least 2 blocks away from the school because he felt it was important to live out his desire to be in solidarity with others who had much less than we did. How impressive that was and continues to be for me, for just a sophomore in high school. Pete played on our high school basketball team and was so good he was recruited by the University of Kansas basketball program. More importantly, he became close friends with his Hispanic and black teammates. For him, that was natural. For them, I think it was a fabulous gift. He was also nationally ranked as a tennis player. He traveled throughout the Midwest, winning tournament after tournament. But the one match of his that I remember more than any others was when he played Butch Buchholz, one of the top 5 players in the country, who later captained our country's Davis Cup team. Pete pushed Butch to the limit, finally losing but by a very close score. That was probably the height of Pete's tennis career. The nadir came later when he asked me to be his doubles partner in another tournament. What a graceful invitation, and what a disastrous result. College. Pete often has said that since my parents spent all their money on sending me to Harvard, he had to go to KU. Well, he made a big mark at KU, much bigger than anything I would have accomplished. He pledged to the Beta fraternity, the one fraternity on campus that really stressed high moral standards. And I continually run into one or more of his fraternity brothers, only to suffer through long stories of how important Pete was in their lives. Pete also played tennis for KU and played guard on the KU basketball team, and now is a starter on KU's annual Old Timers game. One of my proudest moments took place in Madison Square Garden, where KU played University of Cincinnati with Oscar Robertson. I got to sit on the KU bench with Pete in Madison Square Garden. What a treat. I believe it was while Pete was in still in college at the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, was in the process of making a movie that would capture their pioneering program of supporting the faith of student athletes across the country. They chose Pete to be their star of the movie. And in the process, Pete became friends with some of the top professional athletes in several sports. Seminary. After college, Pete joined me at the Episcopal Seminary in New York City, and we had a wonderful time together. I remember two things in particular. First, it became obvious pretty early that Pete had better grades and more friendships than I had. So much for the Harvard advantage. And during his 3 years there, he was president of his class for his first 2 years, and in the third year, president of the student body. And second, we both played on the seminary basketball team. And when we went to play the team of the Episcopal Seminary in Virginia, which included the Kentucky All-American Cliff Hagan, Pete and I together scored 41 points. Actually, he made 39, and I made 2 free throws. What a team. Later, 2 things in the years following Pete's ordination continued to touch me deeply. The first was the occasion of a real crisis in our family. In preparing for his early marriage to Patsy Kendall, Pete had 2 of his high school teammates to be his groomsmen. One was black, the other Hispanic. That was more than my father, a loving but very conservative man, could understand or accept. So my father announced that he would not be attending the wedding unless Pete changed his decision. Pete loved our father, but what was deep inside of him prevailed. Fortunate for all, our family physician called our father into his office and said, "Webb, this is your son's decision, and it's one he's made from his heart. You owe his heart your support. You need to be there as a loving father, grateful for your son's wide open heart." And he was there, and he never regretted it. What a father, what a son. The second thing occurred when Pete and Patsy took their newly adopted son, Brent, to a pediatric checkup. What the doctor told them was that Brent was blind and would never be able to see. After the shock, Pete began to cry. When I asked Pete what the tears were about, he said, "Tom, God has given me 2 lives to live. One as a sighted person, and the other in my life with Brent." And so began a love affair. And Pete has spent every day of his life from that moment in gratitude for the gift of Brent. Years later, when the Episcopal Church produced a movie about gratitude, the place they started was spending a week with Pete and Brent. Pete's life was later blessed by the arrival and life of his second son, Peter, who soon mirrored Pete's optimism and gregarious nature. And some of my best moments with Pete were at Holderness, watching him in admiration of his son Pete, who had given him so many reasons to be proud. Pete had been very much in love with Kathy Carruthers, and she with him, but Kathy's father was a prominent Presbyterian minister, and Kathy knew firsthand how difficult it was to be a minister's wife. So with deep sorrow, she told Pete that how much she supported his decision to go to seminary, that she could not commit herself to living the life of a wife of a pastor, and so they parted. It was many years later, when Kathy had been widowed and Pete divorced, that Pete, on a fundraising trip for Holderness in Denver, asked Kathy out for dinner. One of Pete's faculty members told me that when Pete arrived back at the school, he had been changed so much for the better that the faculty had asked the trustees to send him back to Denver as often as they could. And so began Pete's longest and deepest happiness with Kathy. I have only one incident at Holderness that you all should know about. Well aware of Pete's love of pranks at their expense, the school's trustees passed a resolution concerning a school building that was just about to be demolished. They renamed it the Pete Woodward Building. Maintaining his dignity, a couple of weeks later, Pete asked me to respond to the trustees in using a fake name as a major donor to the school. I was so outraged by their decision to harm Pete as to cause this mythical family to cancel a proposed $1 million contribution to the school. Well, the president of the trustees hurriedly brought the matter before the trustees, and they wrestled for a way to correct the situation. When the president of the trustees stood up, shook his finger at Pete, and said, "Pete, you son of a bitch, you got us." Mark one up for my brother, the headmaster. Well, there's so much more to say, but Pete's family and friends know the rest. But one last thing, and that's Pete's love and appreciation of our sister Joan, and in the process of me. I don't think either of us could be more grateful as individuals and as a loving trio. So thank you, Pete, and happy birthday, big guy.